So what were the biggest towns in England in the 11th century? Well, thanks to a very well-known historical figure, we can actually answer this. I'm referring, of course, to William the Conqueror. In 1086, 20 years into his reign, William ordered the Great Survey, better known as the Domesday Book, the name being a reference to its supposed unalterable nature, akin to the Last Judgment. But far from being unalterable, it's actually given us a priceless insight into how much has changed over the last 900 plus years. It should be noted that the survey only tallied households, so actual populations from the time are based on the interpretations of two historians, namely that of J.C. Russell from 1948 and the more recent H.C. Darby from 1977. I've opted for the former as the primary metric, as it's more specific and has fewer omissions, in case anyone's interested in the technicalities, that is. Either way, let's get straight to it. Number 10. Well, technically joint number 9, as we're starting off with the dead heat. Today, it's famous for being home to England's second oldest university. It is, of course, Cambridge. Of course, back in 1086, the world-famous university here was still 123 years away from its birth. The Anglo-Saxons had set up camp here around the ruins of the Roman fort known as Duro Leponte. In the 11th century, they built St. Benet's Church. This features something extremely rare, an actual tower from the Saxon era still standing today. The Normans built a castle here, but all that remains of it today is nothing more than a mound. Number 9. Exactly the same size as Cambridge at the time, as far as we can infer, was a settlement known to the Romans as Diva, and to us as Chester. The fort of Diva was, by all accounts, one of the most imposing in all of Roman Britain. Following the Roman withdrawal in the 5th century, though, Chester would be later likened to a decaying fortress. The Saxons restored it to its former glory, to some extent, using its existing walls to defend against Viking attacks. Such was its strength that it was one of the last towns in England to fall to William the Conqueror, who then proceeded to build a wooden castle here. Number 8. Next is another ex-Roman fort, although this one later turned into a colonia under Emperor Nerva. The Romans called it Glevum. We call it Gloucester. Whilst these days Bristol is the main gateway to South Wales, for many centuries it was Gloucester that assumed this role, on account of it being the first viable bridging point over the River Severn. In fact, Gloucester's role is integral to this very list, as it was here in Christmas of 1085 that William the Conqueror commissioned the Domesday Book in the first place. He also ordered the rebuilding of the Abbey, now Gloucester Cathedral, as well as the construction of a castle, which is now Gloucester Prison. Number 7. Now to southwest England's largest city, but at the time merely a young town called Brigstow, or as we know it today, Bristol. The known history of Bristol appears not to go back much further than 1000 AD, but by the end of the Saxon era it had developed into a port, doing regular trade with Ireland. Harold Godwinson is on record as having used it as a departure point when sailing to Wales just 3 years prior to his defeat to William the Conqueror. William would go on to order the construction of a castle there, in what is now Castle Park. Number 6. Here's a town whose historical significance doesn't get the fame it perhaps deserves. Said to be the Anglo-Saxon capital of East Anglia, Thetford. The East Angles made Thetford a thriving settlement, although they didn't have it easy, being as they were subject to various Viking attacks. These came both from the Great Heathen Army of the 9th century, who executed their king Edmund, and Svein Forkbeard of the early 11th century, who even became king for just a few weeks. But perhaps more relevant to this list is that Thetford predates Norwich as the bishopric of the region, having assumed the role in the 1070s, and of course no Norman settlement would be complete without a wooden castle, which today is little more than a mound. Number 5. Now to the second former Roman colonia of this list, namely Lindum Colonia, or Lincoln for short. When the Romans came here in the 1st century AD, they built a fort on the top of a steep hill. After the Vikings invaded in the 9th century, they took Lincoln and established it as one of their 5 boroughs of the Danelaw, a topic for another video perhaps. Anyway, the Normans came and built a castle around the old Roman fort, and just over the road on the other side of the hilltop they began work on Lincoln Cathedral. This would later become the tallest building in the whole world, though the Normans can't take credit for that. Number 4. And now to a city so full of history that it's gone by many names: Eboracum to the Romans, Eoforwic to the early Anglo-Saxons, Jorvik to the Vikings, and of course York to us. In short, there was barely a time in history when York wasn't a significant settlement, from the Romans of the 1st century to the Saxons of the 7th century, who made it an archbishopric, and the Vikings of the 9th century, who made it the capital of their territory on this island. The early Norman era was an extremely turbulent time for York, as William the Conqueror went scorched earth on holdout rebels in northern England, starving many of them out in what's referred to as the Harrying of the North. I'll just say this is a somewhat troubling chapter in history, which may account for why just 2 of the top 35 entries in the Domesday Book are from northern England. History is written by the victors, as they say, after all. Anyway, York did benefit from the building of 2 castles, although the first was promptly burnt the very next year, and a Norman cathedral, effectively the groundworks to what became York Minster. Number 3. Now to a city close to the ancient capital of Boudicca's Iceni tribe, Norwich. Much like the earlier entry of Thetford, Norwich was taken over by the Vikings in the 9th century. The Danish settlement was focused around the Tombland area, with its influence evident from street names like Pottergate, Fishergate, and other streets ending in gate, which is actually an Old Norse word for street, also seen in York and Lincoln as it happens. As for the Normans, they built the obligatory wooden castle and began construction of Norwich Cathedral, although not until 10 years after the Domesday Survey. Norwich Market dates from the 1070s, making it one of the oldest in England, and incidentally one of the biggest. But before I get into the top 2, a quick note on potential omissions. Now, for whatever reason, the J.C. Russell interpretation of the Domesday Book has no figure for Bury St Edmunds, whereas the H.C. Darby version has it at 3,000, making it a potential entry for the top 10. But on the flip side, the H.C. Darby version has several omissions of its own, including Bristol for one, and uses weasel phrases like 2,000 inhabitants or more, not more than 5,000, and even nearer 5,000 than 4,000. In any case, I'm not claiming the ordering to be absolute, even if a top 10 list comes with this implication by nature. Mind you, the top 2 that follow are unanimously accepted by both interpretations of the Domesday Book, so back to it. Number 2, and so to the capital of Saxon England, Winchester. When Alfred the Great became King of Wessex, he turned Winchester into a burh, i.e. a fortified settlement designed to better withstand Viking attacks. Several other settlements were similarly fortified by not only Alfred, but also by his son Edward and daughter Athelfled, who later became monarchs of Wessex and Mercia respectively. When the Normans came here, they built, you guessed it, a wooden castle. Then they began to build Winchester Cathedral, adjacent to its Saxon predecessor, the outline of which is today marked out in modern tiles. Unlike the previous entries, the Domesday Book actually contains no figures for either Winchester or the number 1 entry. The reasons for this are unclear, but the implication is that they were known to be the largest by enough of a margin, Incidentally, the original manuscript was known by a Latin name, Liber de Wintonia, or Book of Winchester. Number 1. And the biggest settlement in 1086 was, of course, none other than Bognor Regis. London. Whilst the capital of England was still Winchester at the time, London had exceeded it in population during the latter Saxon era. Edward the Confessor ordered the construction of Westminster Abbey, which became the site of William the Conqueror's coronation on Christmas Day of 1066. William then ordered the construction of the Tower of London, what's largely believed to be the capital's oldest building, barring various bits of Roman rubble, that is. During its construction, he stayed at Barking Abbey, Barking being in Essex at the time. The population of London was estimated at anywhere between 10,000 and 18,000, or about the size of a small town by the standards of today. Perhaps the biggest legacy of the Normans, though, is that of linguistics, as it was their presence that would ultimately turn the Germanic language of Old English into the hybrid tongue that's spoken around the world today, along with its consistently inconsistent pronunciation rules, which give it a certain je ne sais quoi. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.